Whew. All right. Too many people get mad if I don't do that. All right, so Numbers 14:22, the memory verse for the book. And again, God counts and says that for those who have put me to the test these 10 times, because they've seen all of my great wonders, they shall by no means enter the land which I swore to their fathers. Now, that's a similar theme that we've seen before. We've seen this in the book of Exodus with the golden calf, right? The threat was there that he said, these people are not going in. I'm going to wipe them out and start all over with Moses. Let Moses have children and begin again with a new generation, right? That threat was there, and Moses at that time intervened and said, no, but, let them see how your powerful hand can move and have mercy on these people and bring them along. Well, he gives them 10 chances. So, yeah.
Are you going to come back to this verse?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can hold off till.
Yep. And so that's what the book of Numbers does, is it comes up to their 10 chances, and again God says we're going to start with a new generation. And that's a part of the whole outline of the book, right? So when you look at the outline of the book, it's broken down into 3 parts, 3 movements. And at the top, simply outlined the old generation on the beginning of the book, a tragic transition that takes place between the old and the new generation, and then simply the new generation that's going into the land. Now, to understand the book properly, you have to understand that the book of Numbers is designed to for us to understand God's judgment and punishment on the original old generation of the Israelites who came out of Egypt. They are not the ones who go into the land. They all have to die in order for the new generation to go into the land. And so God's punishment on them for their disobedience, which we'll get to, is that they must remain in the camp of Israel and they must live out their lives for 40 years. And at the end of 40 years, God says, you will all have died out, and the next generation is going to go in.
Didn't Joshua and Caleb
Yes.
get to go?
They did.
Oh, okay.
You are correct.
Okay.
They were the 2 good spies, right, who believed the report of God and encouraged the people to trust that God would deliver them into the hands of all those mighty people, right? And so they are the 2 good ones. But so you have a lot of smaller divisions that kind of that help you make sense of the book as you go through, as far as organizing the people, the counting of the people. That's where the book gets its name, the book of Numbers. God says, count the people. Organize them by their tribes, organize them by their families. When we begin to move out and march from Mount Sinai, we need to know how we're going to go. There's a military arrangement to it, right? When military units go out, they fight with their units and their companies, and they stay together, and they know how to travel together, right? And so God gives them kind of a military arrangement to the camp, and He counts everybody so that they know how many people are going, and there's records of every tribe and family in the first few chapters of the book of Numbers to help us to know. Is it easy reading going through? Are you meant to know all the names when you go through there and read? You're really not. There's no quiz on that, okay? But it's helpful to know and read and understand, in the same way you might go to a war memorial, like you go to Washington, D.C., you can look at the Vietnam Memorial and you can say, there are names of people who sacrificed their lives. There are names of people who, mattered in this thing. And, in a similar way, not exactly, but in the same way, this is a kind of a war memorial way, or this is a memorial of the judgment of God. These are the names of the people who did not go into the land. And God made sure that we would remember their names. Right? It's a solemn, somber remembrance in that same way. And so when you break down the book, the middle part is where all the meat is. The middle part is where everybody, you get your historical narrative and you get the reason why they can't go into the land. It all takes place in the middle. And then when you get to the end, they reorganize, they get some reminders about the worship to God, reorganize their worship to God, they reset everything, and then they have a little bit of going into the land, a little sneak preview of going into the land.
About how many years ago was this happened?
So this happened about 1400 BC, roughly.
Oh, okay.
So you're in that time frame. So if you're tracking with the book of Exodus, we ended up at Mount Sinai, and then we couldn't leave Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus. And then for about 10 months, God and Moses are meeting together, and Moses comes out and he's teaching the people the book of Leviticus. He's teaching the law, and he's making sure they're fully prepared before they leave. And you're going to see in the book of Numbers, we still haven't left Mount Sinai. We're still there. So we're still right there in the book of Exodus at Mount Sinai, camping at Mount Sinai, God traveling, not traveling, but living, coming down in the tent that's outside the camp, and Moses going outside to meet him, and we're still there. We can't leave yet. We can't leave yet because they're not ready. And then when they leave, they prove that they're not ready. And then God gives them a chance. And then there are some tests that they fail, and we'll get there. So that's the basic division of the book, 3 parts, right? I like here the preparation to leave, the postponement, right? There's a 40-year delay. And then you have the re-preparation, right? So again, we start out at Mount Sinai. We end up traveling through the wilderness for 40 years until we get to the plains of Moab and into the Transjordan side of Israel. And so that's where the book ends, is that they're going into the Transjordan side of Israel, and then they have their first conquest, and then there's some preparation for the next book of Deuteronomy and the book of Joshua. Okay? So the book of the law, the 5 books of Moses, are all very tightly connected, and they're all very much a single unit in terms of the story that's being told, right? There's it's not like you get from Leviticus and you get the Numbers and you don't know what's going on. Very easy to track every transition that takes place here. So this is what happens. So let me try to get into and we're going to cover some of the first portions of it very quickly. And again, Numbers chapter 1 and verse 1 says this: Then Yahweh spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first of the second month in the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, right? And so we've been staying on Mount Sinai for about a year. And it says, take a census. And this is where the name of the book comes from, the second verse. Number the people, right? In the languages, when it was written, the counting of the people. That's where the name of the title of the book. And take a census of all the congregation of the sons of Israel by their families and by their fathers' households, according to their number of names, every male head by head, from 20 years old and upward. Whoever is able to go out to war in Israel, those are the ones you're counting, and Aaron shall number them by their armies. And moreover, there shall be a man of each tribe, each one of his house and his father's household. And they begin to name them by the tribes in chapter 1, right? Yes, sir.
So I was going to ask you this because the ones that didn't get to go in were younger than, or did get to go in, were younger than 20. Is 20 a number, like it says, because they were old enough to fight?
Mm-hmm.
Because now, like the Jewish people have bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah, but it's normally like at 13 or 16 or something much younger than 20.
Correct. That bar mitzvah idea is their idea of an age of accountability and an age of moving into adulthood, right? You got to remember, before the 1950s, there was no idea in the culture about teenagers. They didn't have a category for teenagers. You didn't get to stay a Peter Pan kid for 10 years.
So this is roughly equivalent to that? This
is strictly for military. Strictly for fighting age. Okay. It has nothing to do with adulthood or an age of accountability or any idea like that. He says strictly, we're thinking of terms militarily now. And you guys are getting ready to march because you're going to go in and fight in the land. As we move and as we travel, you need to know how to move like a military unit because we're going to be engaging the enemy. And so I think a part of Numbers is that their traveling arrangement has the primary focus of military arrangement. Good question. And so you have in chapter 1 there all of the names of the tribes and the families by household, by the fathers' households, and you get all of the names and you get the numbers and the totals added up as they go along, 40,000 from this tribe, 41,000 from that tribe. And so you can add up all the military men that they have, and we know historically now how many people were of fighting age in this group. You have to go through and add them up. I didn't do it for this class. Sorry, I've had it in the past, but I didn't write it down. But you can do the math. So you can add up all the fighting men, and then you figure out all the people who are under 20, and you can get a count of the people, and we know that's why we always say that Israel traveled in the millions, right? They probably had, a couple of million people traveling along the way because of the number of military men that you can count of fighting age. So that ends up, and you get this arrangement of the people in chapter 2. How are they going to travel? Then you get kind of in a sense, the square grid pattern of travel that they're going to go in, and it begins to which tribes are in the front, which tribes are in the middle, which tribes are in the rear, and the tent of meeting in the middle as they travel. And you have all those arrangements that are made in chapter 2 as they go along, and he tells them how they're going to travel, right? This is how you're going to march. And so you go into chapter 3 and you go, this is how the priests and the Levites are going to be arranged, and how they're going to travel with you, and their responsibilities while they travel. Who's going to break down the tent of meeting? Who's going to carry what? Who's going to be responsible for what activities while you're traveling, and what priestly services and duties? And so you have a breakdown there of their order of the Levites and the priests, right? And then you get into some instructions about their setting aside their firstborn, the Kohathites, I can't even pronounce some of them, Gershonites, and Merarites, and they have different divisions of priestly duties. Among the Levites, now separate, you have these 3 family groups that have division of responsibility for their duties. And again, a lot of that is, you're reading it and you're going, wow, that's a lot to get to that point. But it is. God gave very much detail about how they were to travel, how they were to go about, how they were to, God never left details out. And so reading Numbers, you're going, wow, that's a lot of detail, right? So that's your first 4 chapters of Book of Numbers, unless there are questions. So you go to chapter 5 through 10, and again, you kind of get into this arrangement in chapter 5, where Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, command the sons of Israel that they send away from the camp every leper, everyone having a discharge, everyone who is unclean because of a dead person. So what it is that it sounds like we're on repeat, and it sounds like we're getting a lot of details that we already know, right? I've heard this before, right? I've heard this idea of clean and unclean before, and I've heard some of these ideas of sacrifices, and I've heard the ideas about how, what is it? Is it, well, now he's reiterating that these things even have to be kept while we're on the move. So if we're marching, and these people, they've got to march outside the camp while we're on the move. And so, they don't just have to stay out overnight while you're camped. They have to stay outside until they're clean again, even while you're on the move. They can't come into your camp even while you're marching. And so I think that I'm giving you a big overview picture to say why we have all these kind of repeats of the vows and repeats of the things, is that I think the emphasis is that, here's some things to remember, that these things are in place and these things are active even while we're traveling. And so, just because you're mobile doesn't mean that these things don't matter. And especially the clean and the unclean ideas, okay? So I'm going to overview that section between chapters 5 and 10 by saying this is the rules, or the sanctification. This is the preparation for moving out that God gave them, and this is this is what they had to do to prepare for moving out. Again, on repeat, let's remind ourselves how serious it is to travel with God, and that you need to set yourself apart, and you need to create a sanctified mindset even in our marching and our moving, right? And so that's kind of an overview of chapters 5 through 10. Questions, you can raise your questions. Yeah.
Chapter 6, what does it mean if a man or woman wants to make a vow of separation?
So that's the idea. So a Nazirite vow in general has the idea of, I've got something serious on my mind or in my life right now that I want to dedicate some time to the Lord in dealing with an issue, in dealing with a problem, in dealing with a struggle, or whatever it may be in your life, right? A vow is a way of saying, there's a public aspect to it, and there's just a personal, that I'm devoting myself to this because I see God is getting my attention for some reason, right? This is between a husband and a wife saying, it may be a celibate vow, a vow of celibacy, no sex.
But it's a vow made to the Lord?
It is. It is. I'm serious enough about this that I'm setting that part of my life aside while I'm dealing with this. And my husband or wife has to be okay with it, right? That has to be a way in which, when you're going to dedicate yourself that way, it's a part of the clean and unclean thing. You're saying, I'm just going to stay away, I'm going to take a break for the sake of this vow. And then both the husband and the wife are impacted by this, right? So they have to know.
Okay. So it's only related to husband and wife, not anything else.
Correct.
Oh.
That aspect of it, right? If that aspect is involved, it's just giving instruction to how they would handle it, right? For married people. But it's, because if you're not married, this doesn't apply anyway, right? If you're going to do something like that during a vow time and you're not married, you're already in trouble. So. All right, so we're going to try to get into the middle part of this. I can already feel a second week coming on. So maybe I'll surprise. Maybe we'll see how next week goes. But this is the middle part. This is what happens: is that we get to the middle part of the book of Numbers, and this is where everything goes south, right? And so they're literally traveling south, but it goes south. And this is what happens: is that in chapter 10, verse 11, you get into the first of the many problems, but there you go. It says, and this is the important part. Look at what it says in verse 11, and it says, now it happened in the second year, the second month, of the 20th of the month, that the cloud was lifted from over the tabernacle of testimony. That's God's presence. It goes up in the air. That's the traveling position. That means it's like putting the car in drive, right? It's time to go. And it says that the sons of Israel set out on their journeys from the wilderness of Sinai, and then the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. And then verse 13, that's the point I want to make, right? Since Exodus, this is the point that it makes in verse 13. So they moved out for the first time, according to their numbers, right? The command of Yahweh in the hand of Moses. So all the way from Exodus chapter 19 till now, they're moving out for the first time. And Numbers makes that pretty clear. This is where we're at. We have not moved until now. And it doesn't take very long for the problems to come up. Chapter 11, verse 1, right? We get into a major issue.
Do you think the problems are related to the movement? I mean, it's like, I know when we go on vacation, things go crazy, like right when you're trying to go.
I think that's why you just spent 10 chapters of getting military discipline to try to keep order and discipline in the camp.
Because it's a pretty massive undertaking.
And then they act like the kids in the back of a station wagon as soon as they go, right? Yeah. So, or the back of a SUV for my kids. But yes. But they immediately lack their discipline. But what it does is it just brings to the mind, the moment that they leave Mount Sinai, they're going selfish mode, full-on selfish mode, right? And that's the first issue that comes up. It says the people became like those who complain of a calamity in the ears of Yahweh. They became, as a group mindset, right? They caught the bug. They went, oh, we're going to complain. We're not happy. The moment they set out, we don't like the seating arrangements. I wanted that seat. You wanted this. I want to eat here. You want to go there. Don't touch me. He's touching me. Yeah. Right? They're doing all this immediately as they set out. They're like the ones who complain, it says, of calamity in the ears of the Lord. They're going, man, we just left one day into this thing, and you guys are going, oh, it's all going to fall apart. We're dead. We can't survive, right? And Yahweh heard it, and his anger was kindled. And the fire of Yahweh burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. Imagine that, right? Going, glad I'm in the middle part of the camp, right? But the seriousness of it is that God, they think God doesn't hear. They think He doesn't know, right? He doesn't give any warning. He just starts melting the edges of the camp, right? And burning the edges of the camp. They're consumed. And the fear people therefore cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to Yahweh, and the fire died out. And so they give a name to that place, but does it stick in their memory because they name it? It does not. They complain again, and so you get down and you see in chapter 11 verse 10, Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, and the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly. Right? They don't know how to trust the Lord. They have this problem. And so now you kind of get this combination thing. Moses is going, man, we've already been with this, we've only left a few days, one day or a few days, and we're already doomed, and I don't know how to handle this. And so Moses is whining and complaining a little bit, rightly so, but he's saying, we're never going to make it. God, I'm never going to make it with these people because I'm not enough, right? One man to lead them is not enough. God provides the 70 elders to them and says they're going to stand with you, right? They're going to come and take their stand in verse 16. You get a little help along the way, but by the way, we haven't forgotten the complaining. Just because we're moving along here, we haven't forgot the complaining part that started this whole thing, right? And so he says to them in verse 18, we're going to get to that too. And here's Jay's favorite part, right? We're going to give you meat to eat. And we're going to make sure it's coming out your nose. And you're going to have meat every day for 30, not 5 days, not 10 days, not 20 days, a whole month, right? Until you're not going to like meat anymore. I would hate to be somebody who doesn't like meat anymore. That would be horrible. And but God is punishing them by providing in a way, over providing and saying, if you're going to put me to the test, if you're going to doubt me, I'm going to show you how I can provide, right? I'm going to show you that this is not a difficult task for me to provide for you. I can provide so much you don't even know what to do with it. So that when we go along the way, remember that. Because there might be times when you don't have enough. Do you remember how God can provide? Yeah. I remember He can give us more than enough. More than we don't even want enough. We don't even want to eat it enough. Right? And so you have that lesson with the quails that He says, because you have rejected the Lord and said, why did we ever leave Egypt? It was so great there. Remember that vacation town we lived in where we had to make bricks all day? So God is able to discipline them and correct them and teach them even a great lesson, right? And so the lesson, I think, is in verse 36 maybe? Where did it go here? Yeah, so... Oh, yeah. No, it comes down later. It says, you have the rebellion so you have this rebellion that takes place with Miriam in chapter 12. I didn't really get into that. But there's a verse in there where, I know where it's at. Sorry. So, there it goes. Yeah, he's saying, look at chapter 11, verse 21, right? He goes, man, we have, the people among whom I am are 600,000 on foot, and you said you're going to give them meat. What are we supposed to do? Kill every single animal in the whole flock? That's not even enough to do what you want to do. How are we going to do this, right? He's thinking logistics. God says, yeah, don't worry about it. You doubt me? You think I can't do it, right? And that's the point. In verse 23, is Yahweh's power limited? Is that what you're saying? Is that why you're asking this question?
And this is Moses asking.
Yeah.
He just saw him do all the miracles to get him out of Egypt, and he still doesn't understand everything.
I mean, it puts you in the point of, I'm glad God teaches me a lot of lessons, and I'm glad I get them over and over, because sometimes we need that, right? We need that. I'm glad I didn't stop at one lesson, because if I had to learn everything in one lesson, then I'd be doomed, And, but God is going to display it. He says, now you shall see, right? My word will happen for you or not. You're going to see how I do it, right? God just drops quails out of the sky. He just drops them out of the heavens. They just fly over and plop dead for him, And even beyond that, God can just create quail. I mean, we know this. God can just make food. So he can just tell the quail that are alive already, fly over there and die so they can eat you. He can just create new quails. He can do whatever he wants, right? God is a God of unlimited power. And so this first, I say first, but the big major one here in 11 is that the complaining is dealt with. Miriam's rebellion, as I said, is dealt with in chapter 12. And then we get to 13.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Miriam and Aaron, do you think, were they jealous of Moses' authority and they wanted it, or were they jealous of the fact that he married a Cushite woman and she was what? I'm assuming she was...
Probably dark skin, yeah. So I think it has more to do with they were jealous of his authority, but I think also the same thing. They're going, hey man, this is supposed to be a family gig, so there's a part of that. But ultimately, Moses was chosen for that special relationship, and now as they're traveling, their family seems to be blending in with the rest, right? No special privilege, and I think they're saying, we're looking for a few benefits here.
Okay.
Yeah. Why does Moses get it all, right? Why does he have all the authority? Oh, he's the friend of God who's, I'd watch out. And God teaches him a lesson about that, right? And with mercy. They didn't die. So, they didn't die. That's all, usually if you come out of it alive, God's merciful. So,
I always wondered, and my dad actually pointed this out to me,
yeah.
like maybe in the last year or so, that, Moses married the Cushite woman.
Yes.
Did his first wife maybe pass away? Or, I guess it doesn't say, so we don't really know, but I
can't recall. So, I can't recall her passing away as the reason why. Let me think if I can look back at that. I don't know the answer. So, but it's a good question. But again, he does marry and remarry, and other people did too. There was, multiple marriages, even though it begins to get excluded out of the law, right, as they travel. So, my guess would be that it was a death and a remarriage, but I'll have to confirm that. I don't know. Because the law states you're not supposed to have the, you can. But, let me look it up. I can't recall offhand. Good question, though. So when you get to chapter 13, this is the center point of the book. This is the point where we get all of the lessons come to its head, right? Is that they're getting ready to go into the land, what should have been 11 days in a journey. They get ready and they send the spies out into the land. So Yahweh said to Moses, saying, send out for yourself men, so that they may spy out the land of Canaan, which I am going to give you to the sons of Israel. And you shall send a man from each of their fathers' tribes, everyone a leader among them. So every tribe is going to get a portion of land, so every tribe should be represented, and every tribe has a spy that's called out to go into the land. And so that's what they do. Then you get in, and it says in chapter 13, verse 3, that they did. They sent them out from the wilderness of Paran at the command of Yahweh, all of them men who were heads of the sons of Israel. And then you get a recounting from verse 4 through 15 of all the tribes, right? Here's the name of the person from every tribe who went out. They're looking back and going, boy, I wish they didn't name them by name. But they did. Now we know the ones who didn't want to believe. Now we know the ones who were named by name. But we know the ones who did believe. Caleb and Joshua, right? And so you have the names, as it says in verse 16, the names of the men whom Moses sent out to spy the land. And who does Moses choose? He chooses Joshua. And so they go out and they spy out the land, and that's the whole point. And so it says in verse 21, they went up and they spied out the land. And from the wilderness of Zin as far as Rahab, as Lebo Hamath, and they had gone up into the Negev, which is like a desert hill area, and into the Hebron, again, more what they call hill areas. And they're going out through all these things and areas, as it says, where the descendants of Anak were in verse 22. They came to a valley, and there they cut down a branch of single cluster of grapes, and they carried it on a pole between two men, right? So the idea there is why in the world would you take a cluster of grapes and you needed to carry it on a pole between two men? How heavy is this cluster of grapes that you're not just going to, one man can't carry it? How blessed is the land flowing with milk and honey, and how great is the abundance that they can run around and cut a cluster of grapes and they have to tie it to a pole and carry it between two men. It's a picture of the abundance and the blessing, right? This thing is, nobody's going to miss this. There's so much, right? And so they have this report about the abundance of the land, and then they return in verse 25 from spying out the land, and then in verse 27 it says this, they recounted, right? When they get back, they tell the story. They went into the land where you sent us, and certainly it does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit, and they're showing it, right? Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified, and they are very large, and moreover we saw the descendants of Anak there. And Amalek is living in the land of the Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites are living in the hill country, and the Canaanites are living by the sea and by the side of the Jordan. So you have the report that goes out, and it says, man, there's good and there's bad, right? We give it all in the report. Here's the good news, here's the bad news, But they give the report. And Caleb, in verse 30, I believe, yep. Verse 30, you get the good report. Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, we should, by all means, go up and take possession of it, for we are surely able to overcome it. I don't see a problem here. I hear everything you're saying, and I don't see any problem. Right? So we should, by all means, go up and take possession of it. On the other side, verse 31, but the men who had gone up with him said, no, we are not able to go up against this people, for they are too strong for us. And so, verse 32, they give a bad report to the people, to the sons of Israel. And the land which we have passed through to spy out on it is a land that will devour its inhabitants. And all the people that we saw in it are men of great size. And then you have your problem verse. It says, we also saw the Nephilim. The sons of Anak are a part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in their own sight, and so they were in their sight. What are the Nephilim? I have no idea. Couldn't tell you. There's no biblical evidence to give you. There's a lot of speculation. I could give you 20 options, but I can't tell you from the Bible. It has to do with their idea of being mighty and strong or large in stature and size. That's the best. Right? It's a description word that gives the idea. People call them giants in the land or anything else. And they may have an element of being larger and stronger, and they might have had a reputation for this because the sons of Anak are a part of this. Maybe they have a reputation for being the most brutal people in the land. Stronger than the rest. But whatever it is, that's what they said. We're like, man, we saw that army. We saw the strength or the might of this described people. We felt like grasshoppers before them. We didn't feel very strong looking at their army. Right? Now, you get to chapter 14, and this is the crux. Where the people listened to the two reports, who did they listen to?
The bad report.
Yeah, they sure did. They said, we're going to go back to Egypt. Right? All the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is Yahweh bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become plunder. They'll never survive, our little children. Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? So they said to one another in verse 4, let us appoint a leader and return to Egypt. So you have this idea that we got to appoint a new leader, and we got to go back to Egypt. And they even have a plan that said, there's no way we can do that without getting rid of Moses, so we're probably going to have to stone him too, and this whole thing. So they're devising a whole plan about how to go back to Egypt. And Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before the assembly, and they really plead with them, right, in the presence of all the assembly and the congregations of the sons of Israel. And Joshua and Caleb join in verse 6, and they tear their clothes. And then they spoke to the whole congregation in verse 7, saying, the land which we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. And if Yahweh is pleased with us, then he will bring us into this land which he gave to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. But as for you, and here's the point, verse 9, do not rebel against Yahweh, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has been removed from them. Right? They are the source of our inheritance. They are the source of blessing. God is using them to bless us and give us bread. And he says, but look at, their protection has been removed. They look strong, they look mighty, but God has removed their protection, is what he says. And Yahweh is with us to do, so do not fear them. But then all the congregation said, we should just stone them with stones and move on. Right? Yeah, we're not going to listen. It's time to get rid of these 4 troublemakers, and get rid of them and move on. But in the middle of verse 10, as they were thinking and saying this, the glory of the Lord, glory of Yahweh appeared at the tent of meeting to all the sons of Israel. Perfect timing. God knew just when to show up. So, verse 11, when you get there, Yahweh said, right, how long will this people spurn me? And that's where we get into our, we're getting into the crux of the problem. And how long will they not believe in me, despite all the signs which I have done in their midst? I will strike them with pestilence and dispossess them, and I will make you into a nation greater and mightier than they are. Again, we're back to Moses going, remember what I said before? We're back to wiping them all out and starting over with you, Moses. And so, Moses pleads for the people. You can read the whole thing. Moses says to God, remember, this is your reputation on the line. You don't want to wipe them out and start over. And he's praying for mercy again, and he's praying for forgiveness again. And so in verse 17, he says, now I pray, let the power of the Lord be great, just as you have declared. Yahweh is slow to anger. He's abundant in loving kindness. He forgives iniquity and transgression, and he will by no means clear the guilty, though, but he will visit the iniquity of the fathers and the children to the 3rd and 4th generations. God, you want to see this thing continue on generation after generation, and your mercy will allow it. You'll punish the guilty, you'll allow the innocent to continue, and you'll be faithful generation after generation. And so he says in verse 19, pardon, I pray, the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your loving kindness, just as you have also forgiven the people from Egypt, even until now. In verse 20, Yahweh said, I have pardoned them according to your word. And so God says, you're right. It's another opportunity to display who I am, my great power. But the greater display is my loving kindness and my forgiveness. And so he says, I will, but this is how. And in verse 21, but indeed as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of Yahweh. So, verse 22, surely all the men who have seen my glory and my signs, which I have done in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet have put me to the test these 10 times, and have not listened to my voice, shall by no means enter the land which I swore to their fathers, nor any of these who have spurned me see it. They'll never see the land. So there's a correlation to the greatness of the revelation to which they've been given. So because you have seen so much, there's no way I can let those who have seen it go. I can't leave them unpunished.
It's interesting how many times you've read this passage, you still pull things out that are pretty important.
Yeah.
The part that he says in verse 20, I've forgiven them,
Yes.
that's like what we have in Christ, it's like a great picture, but there's still consequences.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So, and then the other thing that I guess I never realized, I always thought that because they refused to go in, that was what caused them to be killed. It's not that.
No.
It's all the things they've done. This was like the last straw.
Cumulative.
It was
Yes.
all-
Yes. And really, again, it has to do with God is a kind God in the sense that He has had great patience up to this point in displaying these 10 times. He counts His 10 times, right? And He says, time and time again, I've given you lesson after lesson that you should have learned, and it's just become clear you didn't learn it, right? And again, this is not talking about the rebels versus the remnant. We're not talking about a division like that. We're talking about one generation to the next. So when He says, I pardon them, there are believing people in that generation. There are believing people who were weak and who gave in and went along, right? And then there were rebels who were not believing and that were willing to stone Moses and Aaron and willing to, get their own way. There's both in that generation. But God, you're right. He says, I have pardoned them, but not one of them is going in, right? The consequences. So they are joining in the consequences with the unbelieving part of the generation, even the believing part of the generation. And so that is because of the greatness of the glory of the revelation which they've seen, right? The glory of God, the closeness. He talks about it in terms of how close they got to the glory of God and how much they've seen, right? There's consequence to that. And so he says, because you've known so much, and the same correlation is true for believers in principle, right? If God in His kindness shows us so much and then we walk away from it, like Hebrews would say, who can neglect so great a salvation and think you can escape? Right? And so Hebrews draws on these very parallels when he warns the people to say, you can't get that close to God and think you can just walk away. Right? There are consequences. So he lays out the consequences and says they cannot, except, he says in verse 24, but my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit and has followed me fully. And then we know later on Joshua is included in verse 30 of chapter 14 as well. Those two go into the land. And he says, this is how it's going to happen. It says, your corpses will fall into the wilderness. Now think about this, because I know that we have a lot of parents in the room. Think about this, having to explain to your parents, yeah, by the time we go into the land, I will not be with you, but I have to get you ready. My job now is to get you ready. Right? I can't go, but I'm going to be here for 40 years or however long in these 40 years, and the job of that generation is to prepare the next one to go in. God didn't just kill them all and wipe them out. He made them stay. And then think about the object lesson to the children that they have to teach and prepare these 40 years going in. Right? There's a whole... You're not let off the hook on that either. So as a parent, you're responsible, knowing that you're not going in, but that you're getting your children ready to go in. And you got to get back on track. And you got to remain faithful.
And we don't really think about, they're moving, and they're not going to, if you have, say, 1 million people that are going to die.
Yeah.
Or more.
Yeah.
And they're moving, they're not going to stop each time somebody dies and have a funeral.
No. It's a trail of tears, like modern history would call, some of those. But it's 40 years of wilderness wandering, or you've heard it called 40 laps around Mount Sinai, right? You're going to travel for 40 years and get nowhere, literally, run around in squiggles as they go around for 40 years. We have no idea their travels for 40 years because much of it's not recorded. But we know that they probably didn't leave very far away, and actually it says an 11-day journey took them 40 years, right? And so that's the consequences of their disobedience in the book of Numbers. This is the center point of the book of Numbers to show the lesson that they needed to learn. And again, it says, even all the ones that you numbered in the beginning. Why was it important to remember all the names? Because he says, remember those names because not one of them is going in. You wrote it down. You know so your name was written down, your family name. You know where you're at. You know where you stand. You know what age you were. You were above 20 and you were in that list. You're not going in. Your families are not going, right? The adult age people of that group. And so God pronounces that judgment. I'm going to try to move along and then again. So chapter 31, he said, remember how you guys said, oh, we could never go into the land because our children would perish. We would never be able to protect them. You're not going in the land, but they are, and I'm going to protect them. So God says, yeah, you were worried about your children becoming a prey. I promise you, I'm not losing one of them. I want to make sure they get in. Just without you. And so he promises, and your sons shall be shepherds for 40 years, and they shall suffer for your unfaithfulness until your corpses lie in the wilderness, according to the number of days which you spied out the land, 40 days. You get 1 year for each day that you spied out the land. And so he gives that pronouncement of judgment. And so it says in verse 36, right, as for the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land, it says, and who returned and made all the congregation grumble against him by bringing out a bad report, even those men who had brought out the very bad report of the land, they died by a plague right there and then. And so God kind of completes this round of punishment on them and by pronouncing this plague on the ones who gave the very bad report. And he goes on and it says that he spoke to them as the people mourned, and yet they had to rise up, and they said, oh, we did. We woke up. We had a clarity of thought from an overnight sleep. We realized we were really bad and we sinned. We want to get back on track and go in the land, so we're going to go in and fight and take the land the way God wanted us to. Moses says, bad idea. Remember, God's already told you that's not going to work, right? They go in and they lose, right? They go in and they lose. So you have that, another lesson for them, and they do not make it against them, and they fall in defeat. And then we get into the wilderness wanderings, chapters 15 through 19. As you get there, you have the whole history and the recounting of their, again, and you have another repeat in a sense in chapter 15, because he says, now if we're going to leave from here, right, just like we couldn't leave Sinai before, if we're going to leave here, let's reset, let's get back on track, let's worship God properly and not do things improperly, except for Korah, who doesn't listen. But, so you have these instructions that are given up, and you have Korah's rebellion. Again, more, lessons to learn for the priests as they go along. But you have a lot of preparation. You get in chapter 20 the importance of the Moses and not being able to go into the land, Aaron and his death. And again, you're marching along to the end of the book as they go along and they travel into Moab. And you have some history, which I'm not going to go into for time's sake, because I know I wanted to do this in one day. We can talk about it and ask questions, but they basically circle around the land to the other side of the Transjordan, and they conquer a little bit of land for the 2.5 tribes that are on the east side of the Jordan. And they make vows to help their brothers and sisters go into the land as they go into the land, and they set it up for going into the land. Now we get to the book of Deuteronomy, right? And we know that Moses has died in the book of Numbers, and we know that they've begun their journey into the land, and the chronology of Deuteronomy is this. It happens, obviously, it takes place before they go into the land and begin to conquer those 2.5 tribes areas of land. Before they ever leave there, Deuteronomy is a flashback to their preparation of leaving there from chapter 20 through 25, right? And all that takes place. And what happens is, and the breakdown is, we'll get to it when we get into Deuteronomy. We will take some weeks in Deuteronomy. I love it. And it's really a series of messages that Moses preached before the people. It's like having the notes. It's like having the notes of Moses preaching. Deuteronomy, he goes back and he says, we just finished 40 years and we're about to go into the land. Let me preach a series of messages to remind you about what God has done these 40 years and what you need to remember before we go back in. And so that's where we'll pick up Deuteronomy and how it fits in the Numbers, is that Numbers kind of finishes the history of their going into the land. Deuteronomy goes back and says this is how Moses preached to us before he died and before we left to go into that land. And so that's where we'll pick it up. Questions can come, again, ask them next week or pick it up next time I'm with you. We'll answer any questions you may have. Father, we thank you for this time. We thank you for the lesson in the book of Numbers. Help us to remember the important parts. Help us to learn something new, even as Jay said, that every time we read this, we may have read this for a number of repeat times in our lives. Help us to learn something new each time we go in. Help us to recall these things as lessons for ourselves, to help us to remind ourselves to walk with a holy God and to humble ourselves as we ought. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.